Well, good afternoon, folks. This is Ron Gallagher with PAMIC, and you're in the right spot if you're here to listen to the seminar about cybersecurity in the remote workforce. We're just allowing the attendees to enter into the virtual room, and then I will do some quick administrative notes and an introduction to our moderator. So just stand with us. Well, the attendees are starting to come into the virtual room, and the number is just starting to slow down a little. So once again, I just want to say thank you, folks, for listening in on today's presentation dealing with cybersecurity in the workforce. This is definitely going to be a hot topic as our companies, whether you're an insurer or a service company or whatever, decides that remote working may be one of the new alternatives in your future, because it does have its own challenges out there. And I was reading an article recently just about how this is likely to be one of the big surges that insurers may see, especially with malware, ransomware, and those kinds of things. So we have an excellent set of panelists today to talk a little bit about this issue. This is Ron Gallagher with the Pennsylvania Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. We're dealing, today's seminar is on cybersecurity in the remote workforce, and we have a very experienced set of panelists. Some you may have seen before. They are all PAMIC members, and I ask that if you're in need of services, you please, contact them at some point, because they're putting their time and effort into this as well. One of the things I want to mention as an attendee, you do have the opportunity to ask questions through this conference call, through this webinar. The easiest way to do that is to click on the Q&A function, and if you hover over the bottom or top bar of your screen, you will see a Q&A. You click on that, and then you can submit your question directly to the panelists for that. You could also use the chat function, but I recommend not using that, because we like to capture all the questions and the answers that we give, and the chat function doesn't do that easily. With that said, I want to introduce our moderator for today. It's a gentleman that I've known for a couple of years now. His name's Jeff Grossman, Jeffrey Grossman. He's a partner at Stradley, Ronan, Stevens, and Young, and he has lots of expertise. I've known him more from his insurance work, but I know he has a broader practice than that. So Jeff, I don't want to mess it up anymore for you, so I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can introduce yourself and the rest of your panelists.
Hi, thanks, Ron. It's great to be here, and we hope everybody out there in their homes are safe and healthy and feeling good about being productive and staying productive and getting through this. We've got a timely topic for you today. I'll just introduce myself and a little bit and our panelists. As Ron said, I'm Jeff Grossman. I'm a partner at Stradley Ronan. I'm in the insurance practice group, and I also have a cyber practice that is about 50% advisory and 50% data breach incident response. And we'll talk a little bit about data breach incident response later on in our presentation. So I won't go through that now. I did some simple math, just sort of thinking about how I wanted to kick this off today. We've all been working from home now for roughly 3 months, if you think about the middle of March to the middle of June. That's roughly 90 days. And if we work 40-hour weeks and we spend half of those weeks actually plugged into a computer and working online, each of us has logged about 210 hours. And that's pretty conservative, because I'm sure, like a lot of you out there, I know I'm on my computer more than just half the day. So that's 200 hours a day, 210 hours since we've been working from home per employee, per employee. So that just gives you some idea of the magnitude of how we've shifted to moving our cyber risk from being in an office on a corporate network and a corporate system with corporate machines to being at home. And what that shift means in terms of technology and security, we're going to get into. But it just gives you an idea of the magnitude of what we're talking about here. That's a big shift. Let me just introduce my panel members briefly. Matt Casperson is here from BrightCore. BrightCore provides a core cloud-based platform for property and casualty insurers. Some of you out there may work with Matt or BrightCore. He is an experienced enterprise risk management professional with many years of running security and privacy programs across a number of industry standards and regulations. Over the years, he's had the opportunity to observe many different threats and work with a number of well-known technologies and implement them to mitigate risks. He joins us today from Salem, Massachusetts, where he lives with his wife and daughter. Matt, thanks for being with us. We also have Ed Cordiano. Ed is the owner of Cmit Solutions. Cmit helps businesses proactively manage their IT infrastructure, and they offer enterprise-class solutions at prices that small and medium-sized businesses can afford. They focus on keeping confidential business data protected while maintaining efficient, reliable, and secure networks. The Cmit franchise has been servicing the IT infrastructure needs of businesses for over 23 years, and it has over 200 offices and 800 technical professionals nationwide. So if you happen to be in their sweet spot as a small to medium-sized business, the benefit is you're working with a very large partner. Ed has an engineering degree from Case Western University and an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. Thanks, Ed, for joining us. We also have Steve Shively. Steve is the Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer of MFX Services. They are a provider of systems integration and managed IT infrastructure services across many industries and government organizations. MFX was established in 2001 and has been providing IT services in the cybersecurity, managed hosting, managed services, and data center spaces, as well as public and private cloud computing. Steve has a PMP designation and received his MBA from Radford University, and he has over 20 years of experience in IT. He's here today from Roanoke, Virginia. Thanks for joining us, Steve. And finally, we have Vanessa Candelora. Vanessa is with Enquiron. Enquiron is a Panamic partner, as all of these companies. Enquiron has Vanessa has over 15 years experience providing products and services to the insurance industry and employer groups. She rejoined Enquiron in 2019, and she supports their affiliation clients directly. She leads account executives, and she effectively launches their new programs and grows existing client partnerships at Enquiron. Before that, Vanessa worked in healthcare data analytics and supported healthcare insurance companies, IDNs, and workers' comp insurers to provide employer reporting, provider analytics, and value-based performance. She has a track record of innovating and successfully driving engagement and adoption of professional services and tools through partnering closely with her clients. Some of you out there may know Vanessa, as Enquiron offers services in the cybersecurity space directly to Panic members as a benefit of membership. And she'll be telling us more about that toward the end of our presentation. So what are we going to try and accomplish today? In broad picture or broad strokes, we're going to identify the enhanced risks that have resulted from moving from corporate workforce in a corporate environment to a remote workforce in a home office or internet cafe type of environment. Then we're going to talk about how companies are implementing best practices to protect against these enhanced risks. Many of the risks are the same that existed before we shifted to a predominantly remote workforce. Some are new. Those that were around before may be more prevalent risks now, and we're going to explain why. So if the risks are not now more prevalent or more severe, obviously the mitigation measures need to be more significant. So we're going to talk about how to balance those risks with mitigation efforts. And finally, we're going to talk about compliance and how compliance measures have changed since moving to a remote workforce, and how those best practices have changed as well. So let's kick this off, and I'll start by picking on my friend Steve. Steve, could you talk a little bit about how cyber risks have increased as a result of remote working?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me. And I think the simplest way to probably set the stage for that is, as you mentioned, Jeff, a lot of the risks are the same. However, if you think about the pool that the threat actors or bad actors have to now, to fish in, if you will, the pond just got a lot larger. I'll give you an example where we've seen clients have probably 35 to 40% of their workforce working routinely in a remote fashion, remote setting, almost overnight, as you mentioned, in the last 90 days, but in particular those first few weeks, that went nearly to 100%. So just establishing the ability to work remotely created a number of challenges and complexities for the companies having to provide those services, and the employees who typically would not work remotely having to get into that routine, use various methods of connection, and we're going to talk about a lot of those. And then with that came all of the various attacks. So whether the attacks became more prevalent because you had people who maybe were even displaced in the workforce, now they see opportunities to launch malware, ransomware, phishing campaigns, and so forth. I think it's a factor of all of these, and then you look at how do those risks increase because of things like personal laptops versus corporate. In some of the offshore or global settings, I've even seen the use of rental laptops, and the risks that come with those. And then you have non-standard protections, like non-standard antivirus that is not your corporate standard. Vulnerabilities, the vast exposure with more remote work opens up more vulnerabilities, and that's really a main attack vector that will be discussed today. But obviously that's increased. The use of cloud storage devices that may not be company sanctioned, then you have to start thinking about your data leakage, right? So all of these things are increased risk. But one other example I'll give you, and it probably will resonate with some of the insurance audience today, is that with a specific insurance client, they had over 300 BPO or business process users that are doing either some type of claims processing or underwriting type processing in a global environment, never allowed by policy to work remotely, always working within the office space with all of the security protocols and so forth that come with that. In almost an overnight fashion, those 300 some BPO users are now working remotely, and there were no laptops available, corporate laptops available. So again, went to personal, went to rental, had to deal with the non-standard AV and things of that nature. So hopefully that paints a picture of how those risks increased almost overnight.
Thanks, Steve. That does paint that picture. What I'd like to do a little bit, Matt, if you'll help us, is drill down on what these sort of types of attacks are. You heard Steve mention ransomware and phishing, things like that. What are you seeing out there that companies are now fending off with remote workforces out there.
Yeah, and couldn't agree more. Steve hit on a lot of really important points there. From a social engineering phishing standpoint, I think we all walked into 2020 thinking we were going to prepare our typical tax season phishing scam trainings, and what we ended up with in reality were a number of COVID-related phishing campaigns around if anybody on here hasn't received some sort of email from their bank, from their third-party provider about their preparedness for COVID. I think we were all spammed with those emails. Threat actors are piggybacking on those patterns and identifying those things to then carry out attacks against individuals. So that's one example. And then related to that is also they're looking at major providers. So they're going to look at a behavior of a workforce going remote, going out and focusing on buying things like VPN, and they're going to craft campaigns for end users to say, click here for your new corporate VPN that takes them to a malicious website or drops a malicious piece of software on the machine. So that's one example in addition to just COVID-related campaigns. Home networks come with a plethora of considerations, sharing networks with different devices that may not be corporate assets. Everybody on this call is probably familiar with having some form of a smart device or an Alexa or a smart TV that may be on the same network as a corporate asset. So that becomes a consideration. Attacks on remote infrastructure. So VPN solutions are seeing an uptick in attacks on their infrastructure. So those providers are having to stay pretty resilient when it comes to attacks. And then I think just the final couple here are, Steve talked about using a little bit the data management piece. So you're under this vast amount of pressure to continue your operations. You're trying to find these solutions very quickly to find ways to do things as simple as share a file with a employee that you work with or a staff member that used to have an internal file share or defined solution, and now you're trying to scramble to find a good solution. And being prepared for that is a challenging thing to do for sure. And then in addition to that is if you have monitoring teams or a security operations center, a SOC that's used to focusing on those corporate networks, you now have created 40 networks or 100 networks that they're trying to figure out. We have a lag, and how do we align the new threat profile to how we're going to monitor going forward? So these are just a few of the many examples that are out there in terms of what are security teams facing today or technical individuals.
Yeah, I'd just like to add maybe on the ransomware, definitely the prevalence of that is growing. It's such an easy it's such an easy thing for the threat actor to cash in on, and now with so many more remote opportunities to do that, and that's that can hit you at the individual user level and encryption of a machine, or worst case is make its way into your corporate network because these controls may not be as tight or as layered as they were previously before all the remote work. But it's a lot harder for a threat actor to get in, get your data, sell your data on the dark web. It's a lot easier to get in, encrypt it, hold it for ransom, get the payday, and move on. We're seeing that as a much more prevalent attack, something that we'll probably focus in. I know a couple of points later in this discussion, we plan on probably hitting on a few points there, but I think ransomware and the prevalence of it is something everybody should take note of and be prepared to protect against.
One other point to make there on ransomware is how the tactics have changed. Even toward the middle of 2019, ransomware was a criminal coming into your network and freezing your data and not allowing you to work with it unless you paid the ransom. And companies, in order to meet that risk, got very good at backing up their data so that if there was encryption, they would simply restore from an archive and tear the ransom note in half, so to speak, and throw it in the trash. The ransomware attacks have become more sophisticated and more ransomware gangs, if you will, are following a new pattern, which is to not only encrypt your data, but before they do that and send you a ransom note, they steal your data or exfiltrate it to their network. So now they have your data, then they freeze it on your network, and they post a portion of that data on what would be commonly referred to as a shaming site. And then they let you know, hey, we froze your data, but we also stole it, and we can make it all public. So just go to this website and see a sample of what we posted. And that's, a minuscule amount of the data we exfiltrated. So if you don't pay the ransom, we're just going to keep publishing your data to the public. That's a new tactic, and it's working very well. Since 2019, the average ransom payment has increased almost tenfold, according to some sources, from roughly $30,000 for a ransom payment to $300,000 for a ransom payment. So we are seeing this more, and we expect to see it more. And the point to be made there is that the backups that might have made you feel secure in meeting a ransomware attack back in 2018 or even a good part of 2019 probably is no longer the best defensive measure you can put together. So we're going to talk more about that later. Ed, would you comment on endpoint security? Because that's a point that I think Matt made, that we went from being inside of a corporate network to now having all these sort of fractured networks. Would you talk a little bit about that and how that changes the risk calculus?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, it's an interesting environment because as I was listening to Matt, and Steve talk earlier, when you used to look at it, you'd say, okay, all of my assets are behind a company-owned firewall and other layers that are there. Now you've got a scattered and fragmented IT infrastructure. And so, certainly as an outsourced IT provider, we kind of take a look at that and say, well, how does that work? How do we do that? How do we manage that? And how do you, as a company, manage those endpoints? And so certainly you're no longer behind that firewall anymore. Are there ways you can VPN to that firewall? Certainly, depending on what you need to do. Somebody earlier, I can't remember if it was Matt or Steve, talked about, the use of a SOC, a security operations center. And there are more sophisticated endpoint security measures that you want to understand and take a look at. We preach all the time, it's really a layered approach. It's not just about the antivirus. It's not just about the firewall. It's about the firewall and the antivirus and the security operations center, which is kind of acting like an AI plus human interaction kind of proactive, I call it sometimes antivirus with steroids, kind of an approach to monitoring and defending harmful things to your system and to your computers. Now all of a sudden things like patch policies that used to be governed and managed by somebody else, now kind of falls on the endpoints. Once again, we call, the endpoints, the individual workstations, whether that's a laptop. Literally, we had clients that ran out of laptops. There was certainly with COVID a big run on computers that hit the market. So they were literally telling employees, okay, unplug your desktops and your monitors, put it in your car and take it home because that's going to be your computer that you're going to be using, and then set it back up at home. So we were literally going through the whole, make sure you plug things into, outlets that have protection on that and things like that. But patch policies are definitely, you want to make sure that from an endpoint perspective, that each one of those computers are being patched properly with both operating and, most importantly, security patches. A lot of people think, oh, well, Microsoft and the other antivirus companies, they just push those off automatically, so it's going to happen. Well, there's a difference between pushing off a patch to a computer or an endpoint and actually having that patch be installed on those endpoints. A lot of times people don't reboot their computers in a proper way. So they might have 2, 3, 4 updates, just kind of, I like to call it, I use I use the computer in the company. I use an analogy with the home front. And so a lot of times I say, you know, those patches, they get to the front door, but unless you open up the front door and bring that box in, it's just going to be sitting at the front door. Well, that's the same thing that happens with patches, operating patches, security patches. You got to reboot your systems on a regular basis so that the systems can take those patches that get pushed off, quote unquote, automatically, then actually install them properly onto the systems. You know, when you go to a home environment, I also heard one of my other panelists mention the Wi-Fi in the home environment. The Wi-Fi in the home environment to people like us can be a scary thing sometimes because you're talking about, you know, kids playing video games on the same Wi-Fi that you've got your company computer on doing the same thing. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do, but if your internet service provider has, you know, their gateway and router structure where you can separate those networks, you really want to try to do that. And, you know, there's a million different ways you can do that depending on your internet service provider, et cetera. So to try to get into that can get a little complicated. But if you can, you really want to separate between the Wi-Fi network that you're working on at home and the Wi-Fi network that your Alexa and your video games and your smart TVs and all of that kind of stuff and your unprotected home computers are working on. And then it also brings up that last point, which is, you know, the whole, you know, bring your own device environment that we're now faced with in today's reality. Bring your own device can be a pretty challenging thing from a security and infrastructure perspective. At the bare minimum, you know, you really want to make sure that you have at least fragmented that computer so you have your own login and your own credentials for that, completely separate from any of the other stuff that the kids are doing with schoolwork or, you know, video games or whatever. So, you know, these sorts of things all kind of build on each other. They do add, being at home does add a layer of complexity that you definitely want to be aware of. And, you know, those are some of the things that we help to train our clients on and protect them as much as possible. And then you, Jeff, also mentioned the backups. While you hit it right on the head, that used to be the silver lining. It is no longer the silver lining that can swoop in and save you due to their tactics that they're now using. However, you know, we're also looking at a situation where backups are still extremely important. Managing those backups are extremely important. We had a situation with a client just the other day where, because of the home environment, you know, people are always trying to do their own thing. And they had an environment where they were storing things to OneDrive. And a gentleman was going to try to automate something so that he could download things properly from the OneDrive system. If there was one person in that company that should not have been trying to do something, this was the individual at any rate. So he was trying to do something electronically that he should not have been doing. He got about halfway done and said, you know what, this just isn't going to work. And he hit the delete button on that. Well, what he ended up doing was hitting the delete button on about 20 different folder structures on the company OneDrive system. And all of a sudden they just started disappearing. So they had a backup system. We stopped that whole deletion process. We went back, we restored from the backup. They were back up and running within a half hour, no big deal. But it was because of the backup system. And because people are now remote, they're not in a cozy, you know, environment of an office. They may try certain things. It's not malicious in any way, shape, or form, but it's still something that can affect your infrastructure. So.
Thanks, Ed. That's great. There's a lot of good tips in there for ensuring better protection. And along those lines, Steve, I'd like you to comment a little bit, if you would, please, on employees using a home machine versus using a work machine. A lot of us are home with company-issued laptops, but some of us aren't. What can a company do to be better protected when they have employees using non-company machines?
Yeah, and I think some of this we've touched on, so I'll not try to cover the same ground to just be repetitive, but I think, it is possible to connect securely with, a personal machine, a non-corporate machine. I believe that a policy, first and foremost, is where you start with that. So you have a bring your own device, a personal computer policy. It does need to continue to get updates, and those, with the restart of the computer. So making sure that happens, making sure that machine is attached to a network that's hopefully segregated in your home from, the Xbox and the Ring doorbell and the smart thermostat and the things that probably don't get updates. So, that's part of it. And then I think the other thing you need to look at with your corporate machine is it's a little bit risky if you're trying to use a corporate machine or a personal machine, connected to a corporate VPN, because the risk to the corporation is that your personal machine has issues, and then the VPN gives you really a secure gateway to connect into the corporate network. So one of the biggest things I would say avoid is the mixing of personal machines with corporate VPNs because of the risk to the corporate network. But also, a lot of the bring your own device policies come with a management type of software, which says, okay, I'm at least going to control your corporate email that's on that machine. In the event something happens, I can delete it. I can, there are software that companies can use to help make that a safer proposition for everyone. But, basic stuff, complex passwords, which we'll talk more about, keep your machine up to date and have it on as secure a network as possible. So those are the points I think I would emphasize there.
Thanks, Steve. You mentioned VPN and how you access into the corporate network. There's VPN, there's Cisco, there's other competitors out there. Matt, if you would talk a little bit about, regardless of which system you're on, what are the best practices that companies should be thinking about in terms of remote accessing through one of those solutions?
Yeah, and I'll touch a little bit just to echo what Steve said. There's particular software, it's called mobile device management software. You can do enforcement of policies too, encryption policies, firewall policies that can complement some of that stuff. And that also kind of relates to what I'm going to talk about here in terms of the access to the employer network. So if we kind of take a step back and think about how we define the employer network, for many of us or all of us, it's probably changing. I work at Brightcore. We're a remote first organization. So we don't have a physical office that has a employer network. We have employer networks via our cloud services. And then we have an extension of those networks, which are our staff's networks. So we have 200 plus different networks that are part of that ecosystem. And then you end up right now with a hybrid definition, really, of you potentially have policy statements around how you're defining your controls for your employer network that you may need to revisit to expand that out to say, well, due to the interconnectivity, I'm really going to consider these extended home networks or cafe networks when I'm writing my policies and control statements. So the challenge in a remote setup is always figuring out how to address the collection of interconnectivity, meaning how things connect from home network through VPN to my employer or corporate network. So while things are not owned by the employer, definitely still relevant from a security and privacy standpoint and must be considered. And there's no right answer. To say there's a silver bullet or a be-all end-all solution is just doing a disservice to everybody from a technology perspective. It's for us, it was always about finding the right fit. So we use mobile device management software that enforces controls, that enforces deployment of our antivirus and endpoint detection and response solution. And it's, like Ed was saying before, a layer of things that get deployed that works for us. And there's many different, scenarios out there to consider. So virtual private networks, or VPN, the most common, 3-letter acronym that we've probably all heard as we've shifted to remote working, is something that may or may not make sense for your organization. And I'll use a couple examples. So Steve mentioned a VPN or corporate VPN being used by a personal device that could basically just be creating a tunnel that a compromised machine or something listening on that network that was also compromised could use to pivot into your employee or employer network on your physical location. So in that model, maybe doesn't make the most sense, and you might want to kind of rethink that. Or a different example could be that since we've all left our physical offices where we may have been relying on things like maybe you have some physical security practices because you have security guards who have monitoring systems if doors become unlocked that can't visit the premise. So who's really watching the security around those physical locations to prevent somebody from walking in and plugging into your network? And now you potentially have somebody who's sitting there listening with something like Wireshark or a really basic tool to just sniff stuff traffic as it goes by. So in summary, it's about kind of identifying where the weak points are, what's kind of the right fit that aligns to the current context of the business and how it's operating now. That would improve kind of the security and privacy posture. And there's a number of solutions out there. I think mobile device management is certainly a good kind of table stakes foundational thing to try to focus on. But I wouldn't say, at least in my opinion, I'm not somebody who's going to say that VPN is the be all end all secure authentication solution to focus on. And would definitely value the panelists to weigh in here because they've definitely got some different exposure and perspectives in this realm.
Thanks, Matt. Ed, I want to ask you about the way we access these networks. It's typically with a password. Sometimes it's with what folks call multi-factor authentication, or MFA. What are you seeing in terms of how companies are beefing up protection in that realm?
Yeah, thanks. Certainly passwords are, once again, another layer. Passwords are certainly a changing environment too. If you were to ask 10 quote unquote experts on the best type of password and what to do, you're probably going to get 10 different answers. So it's constantly evolving. Now one of the latest things is, use a long phrase, certainly, greater than 12 characters and things like that, upper, lowercase, numbers, special characters, but maybe put it in a phrase so that it's something you can remember rather than just a whole bunch of digits and numbers and letters and characters that make no sense to anybody and you're never going to be able to remember it. So, you definitely want to do that, but it's kind of, once again, as we talk about the different things that you can do, it's here again, a layered approach. And so really anymore, passwords are needed, and obviously the first layer of defense, but anywhere and everywhere you can put in what you'll hear as MFA, multi-factor authentication, or 2FA, two-factor authentication. You really want to implement that for yourself and for your team, and from, Steve keeps mentioning a policy perspective, put in there as a corporate policy, as a company policy, that you have to build in two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. And what that's going to be is simply after you put in your password, you're going to either be pinged for a code. Well, you're going to be pinged for a code, and that can come in one of 2, 3, 4 different ways. But the most common are, a text message to your phone, where then you put in the code that gets texted to you, or you can, put something on your smart device, such as Google Authenticator and some other devices or some other programs that they have out there, and those will randomly generate the numbers that you need for a multi-factor authentication. And then that way, really, there are so many different tools out there that are readily available to what I call the bad actors, where they can come up with millions of combinations of passwords in a relatively short period of time. And if they wanted to, they could get your password. So really having that dual layer in there, where you not only have your password, but you have your multi-factor authentication, is really the way to go in today's world. Another real quick thing I did want to point out too is, we really try to shy away from autofilling and things like that. A lot of people are doing, a lot of different portals, a lot of different websites. Oh, let me just autofill. Let me just autofill. Really shy away from doing the autofills whenever possible, and that's just, once again, another way to protect yourself.
Thanks, Ed.
Certainly.
So we've talked about a lot of various technological ways to better protect in the remote workforce. Security experts talk about the security of any given corporation in terms of cybersecurity is only as strong as the people who access the network. The human factor element, or the final line of defense, if you will. So why don't we pivot here? And Steve, if you could sort of introduce our audience to that philosophy, if you will, of how it's really training people and why it's people who are most often, the fault point in terms of an unwanted actor getting into a network. And how measures of protection on the human factor side of the equation can help.
Sure, I'll do that. Just to capitalize real quick on something Ed said right before I jump into that. The multi-factor, two-factor, I think, is one of the best ways to defeat the ability of somebody to crack a password. That even complex passwords can be cracked so easily with tools in the cloud today. So, and I've heard Matt and Ed both say, and I can't agree more, that layers and layers and layers, there is no silver bullet. So I think just if the audience is listening to take a few things away, there isn't a single answer. From a technology standpoint, the layers make sense. And then you test, and you don't rest. All right. But then when all of that's said and done, the weak link becomes the people, right? Because with all of that security, if they give up their credentials, if they click on a malicious link and allow some malware in that may be part of a key logging program, or open up a reverse shell that allows people to connect back to your machine when you're not even there. These are the things that people can give away and defeat these layers of security oftentimes. So we do a lot of what's called social engineering in a white hat manner, which means we're in there to do no harm, but we'll develop elaborate phishing campaigns with websites that look very legit, and emails around phishing, that the topic may be COVID, the topic may be now your stimulus check, or something of that nature that's gonna, or politics these days that people want to respond to, and they want to read, and they want to click, right? And that's the that's the thing you have to be extra careful of, because the really good threat actors make these things hard to detect. But a lot of the threat actors out there throw a pretty wide net, and you can look for things like the less than stellar use of English, and the grammatical mistakes, and hovering over links that don't seem to align with the email you may see, or the link. So but there are other things such as USB drops, where everybody's curious. You want to pick up that USB and stick it in your machine, and some companies block them, some don't. When we do these tests, we masquerade them as keyboards. So when you plug in a USB that looks like a keyboard, the machine doesn't block it, and then boom, we've opened up a back door. So the threat actors are out there doing this, and the people have to be cautious of it, and training, constant reminders to put the people in as one of those layers, the most important layer, really.
Yeah, and just if I could piggyback on that a little bit, I mean, we can put all the different layers of technology out there, as Steve and Matt were both saying, but when it comes down to it, not for any malicious reason, personal mistakes, and, you'll hear another acronym, SAT, security awareness training, in just getting the employees to try to be a little bit more diligent about what they're reading and what they're doing and how they're doing it. Asking themselves, does this really make sense? We had an incident here, I'm in the greater Cleveland area. We had an incident here where there was an ACH payment that was made, a couple different wire transfers made. It was one of those phishing schemes where a contractor said, "Oh, we've changed our bank account, and this is our new bank account." And a company literally wired, I think it was four $500,000 payments, so it totaled $2 million. By the time it was all said and done, to a different bank account before it was captured and caught. Obviously, FBI got involved, things like that. And there's a situation where they had all of the technology tools, in place. And simply somebody got an email and said, "Oh, okay, well, then this is their new ACH." So going back, I think it was, Steve talking about policies. What kind of policies do you have in place, especially when it comes to any sort of money transferring and things like that? I always tell, our clients, certainly when it involves money, and certainly when your gut just isn't kind of feeling right about something you're reading, you can go back to what I now call old technology and then pick up this thing called a phone. Now, you do have to talk to somebody, but that means you're going to have to, did you really send that email? Is this really you that sent this? And is this really the right number now? And get that confirmation, not via text, not via another email or whatever, but literally by picking up the phone and having that kind of, or even in today's modern day and age, a video conference. You see the person, you hear the person, you understand, yes, this is actually going on. So I couldn't agree more with Steve on the personal human interaction piece.
And we've all, heard those horror stories. I guess what I'd like to hear from you or Steve or Vanessa or Matt, how do you pound it into your workforce? How do you pound it? The folks on this panel and a lot of the folks in our audience, the hairs on the back of our necks go up when we see a suspicious looking email or when we get some clickbait, because we know it's out there and we're dealing with, this as a problem on a day-to-day basis. How do you get the folks in your company or our audience members' companies, how do you get them to be that reactionary so that they're as vigilant as, someone who's studied this and understands it is?
Yeah, this is Matt. I'll jump in on that one first. And just to give some anecdotes from my own company and past who have seen the wire transfer incident. I've been part of that. The gift card, CEO sends an email, go buy me a bunch of iTunes gift cards. These are very common scenarios. At Breakcore, we do quarterly internal phishing campaigns, all white hat stuff, because we're obviously on the inside. And then we're tying it to prevalent things. So the last two were about click this link for our new business resiliency document that we just rolled out. So we're, some people might think we're actually being a little mean in some of these, but it's for good reasons. And then the prior one was around Kobe Bryant, around the death of Kobe Bryant this year. So being vigilant about the content and thinking from the mind of the end user, what are they the most likely to click to, interact with, and not taking it easy, quote unquote, on them, goes a long way in training them, even if it, it might cause a little bit of, angst on their part because they didn't like the topic or whatever, but it's for their benefit and the benefit of the organization. And then to kind of tail off of that, there are situational examples. So in the last 3 months, we've seen an example where we got a phishing campaign from a trusted service provider where their services were being abused about one of our other service providers. So then pounding, maybe pounding is not the right word, but continuing to educate in a rigorous way certain people caused that to be flagged by, a couple engineers who were being targeted, so that we got point in time situational education training material out to the entire organization before we had a single engineer click a bad link and provide credentials. And they were phishing for, MFA tokens. So even MFA in this example would have been not a defensible, not a worthy defense. Those situational examples are good processes and a good kind of regimen to have in place, I've found in my experience.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback real quick on that before we, it's really just about education. most employees out there, really do care and really are concerned about doing the right thing. And so with education, with a little bit of knowledge of, do you see this email? This is, do you see this and do you see that? They start to, I give cybersecurity presentations, all over the place. And it's funny because by the end of the cybersecurity presentation, I get so many people coming up to me and they're just more paranoid than anything. So, they're like, you really need to just, instead of labeling it as cybersecurity, just label the presentation as Paranoia 101, because by the time I get done with the presentation, they don't even want to turn their computer on sometimes with regards to the different, learning about the different vectors that are out there, learning about the different things that can happen. So I just think, really education is the way to start.
Ed, let me just jump in on that too. I'm so glad you mentioned that because I once had a chief security officer that talked about the employees being the best line of defense. We talk a lot about the technology and the human aspect, and everyone is kind of doom and gloom that the employees are going to break everything down, right? But it can be a more positive approach so that you're not scaring all your employees into taking training, but you're encouraging them to be the best line of defense that you have against a cyber attack. And I'll walk through it in a few minutes, but we've got a lot of these online training courses already available to you as PAMIC members that you can administer throughout your entire organization for employees that'll help them identify some of these phishing emails and try to be the best line of defense that you can have as a company.
Yeah, I think I'll add just something quickly to reinforce what Vanessa said. In the social engineering exercises that we've done in the past, I'll give you just one quick example. It was done annually. So year number one, we had a very good success rate of getting employees to give up their credentials to a phishing campaign or a follow-up phone phishing campaign where we called masquerading as the help desk. But where we went out and got a lot of our information was on LinkedIn, Facebook, Google. Learned a little bit about the organization, learned a little bit about their employees. We targeted a specific type of employee which we thought was junior to the organization, and were actually able to penetrate the organization. And then we went back to the board of directors, dropped the report on the desk, followed that up with the training that Vanessa just alluded to, helping to make the employees the best line of defense. The next year we came back in and just a marked difference in the improvement of the overall employee awareness. And we were not very successful in actually in that exercise because the employees were much better trained and much better prepared. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, what you're talking about or talking around, Stephen, is a culture of compliance. I mean, when you're liaising with a board of a company on cyber security, I mean, that's what you really want to see. You want to see this topic be top of mind at the highest level of a company. The best practices in this realm include, a compliance program that isn't just within the IT unit of a given company, but it's really within the leadership of all business units at a company, and a committee be formed to address cybersecurity issues and prioritize the measures that are needed, and to work with, outside help if need be, to identify those risks and identify the most cost-effective way to mitigate them, to have real cybersecurity governance within a company that includes not only all the things I'm talking about now, but also having a data breach response committee, so that when you are infiltrated, and I say that not if you are, but when you are infiltrated, you've got the right people and the right playbook in place. And there's all kinds of infiltrations. I'm not suggesting that everyone's going to be the victim of a ransomware attack that's going to sideline their business. But there are threats that need to be fended off all the time. And to be able to have a committee that's cross-sectional in your company, that's facile with all of this, and able to quickly make decisions is really important. It's really important because the threats are always changing. So you've got to be adaptable and you've got to be nimble. And it takes leadership and knowledge in terms of where the business data assets are, what are the crown jewels, what are the operations that are required to run your business in terms of software needed and where that's going, what are your objectives, and then monitoring the threats along the way and being able to look around the corner and see what's coming. That's all real business critical stuff. So there's a whole compliance piece to this and corporate governance piece to this that I'm just scratching the surface on, but we would be remiss if we didn't mention it here. It looks like we've got about 5 minutes left in our hour. So I'm going to ask Vanessa to then go ahead, Vanessa, please let the audience know, particularly the PAMIC members out there, what is available to them to basically leverage right now and work with Acquiron.
Great, thank you so much, Jeffrey. So can you all see my screen? I hope. Great. So through the PAMIC.info site, the membership portal, you can all access this as PAMIC members through the member area under online training access. We're talking about the PAMIC Law, HR, and Cyber Center, and that's where we are here. So if you need to remember your username and password or something, feel free to reach out to our customer service. But in here, we have a ton of cyber resources. There's been a lot of discussion about training employees, policies, employee policies, not necessarily insurance policies, but the employee policies of what to institute to make sure your data is protected, make sure your employees know what's expected of them. Like I think as Ed mentioned, downloading security patch updates when they come up. It's a very important thing to do. So making sure that your policies in your employee handbook are fully updated is a great aspect. So within here, if I just go straight into solutions, you can see there's a Cyber Essentials right in here that you all have access to. And we've got a number of online training courses, over 9 or 10 courses that, again, you can implement with your employees, covering phishing threats, just overall best practices, physical security, maybe a lesser focus module, or maybe more focus if you're starting to open up your offices and you want to reinstitute some training there to remind people, make sure you look that the door is closed behind you, things like that. We also were just talking a little bit about making sure you have a committee together, Jeffrey was mentioning, and we have this great incident response plan in here. So you can start with a simple scorecard that will evaluate your existing incident response plan across a few different areas to make sure that you're thinking of everything more strategically. And then that scorecard will lead you to what template you may want to start with. It's also a good opportunity if you're updating your response plan. Jeffrey pointed out a lot of great best practices and things to think about, and you want to make sure that you're updating that committee and updating those practices, because somebody leaves and they're the point person when an incident occurs. What do they do now, right? So you want to make sure that you act quickly, because that's one of the most important things when you're having an incident, is act as quickly as possible and make sure your practices are in order. Jumping over to resources in just a minute or so. So under the Cyber Essentials, we talked a little bit today about bring your own device, and we have a ton of resources in this section that you can search for. So if I just do bring your own device, there's 3 ways to boost cybersecurity in a bring your own device environment. And that may be a really helpful read for you to understand what kind of policies you want to put in place there. We also have data protection policies and other valuable tools in here. And then lastly, in just our last minute, I'll point to this Get Advice section. So here you now have Cyber Essentials advice and counsel. So if you read something, if you have questions to follow up here, you can actually go into our site and submit your question about cybersecurity and get a response from a cybersecurity expert no later than the end of the next business day. So feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. We're coming down to the final minute here, and we did have one question from an audience member, so I'm going to go ahead and read that. How do you see cyber insurance policies responding to the quick pivot to remote working from an office-based environment? Do you have a recommendation for policyholders to assure their remote workforce is covered by the cyber policy? Great question. The insurance market, the cyber insurance market, is really on the forefront of most, if not all, of what we're talking about. And if you're out there and you're a business and you don't have cyber insurance and IT is part of your business, you really ought to consider talking to a broker and learning what kinds of products are out there. In terms of the pivot to the remote workforce, some of the companies that lead in that space are definitely putting out a lot of content and talking about a lot of the same topics that we're talking about here. How to beef up security, if you will, when you've got more machines that are not company machines. The second part of that question relates to exactly that. It really depends on the language of your policy. So it's difficult for me to opine as to whether you're going to be covered. I've had that question from clients, and I've examined policies on that precise issue, and I can tell you that it really does depend. That's a great question for your broker. So my recommendation would be, if you're concerned that you have more people now remote working and you have cyber cover that may or may not respond to that, talk to your broker or call an insurance lawyer and talk to an insurance lawyer, because it would very much depend on the language of your policy. Anything else to add to that from the group on cyber insurance and how it's responding to the changing threats with a remote workforce? Okay. All right. Well, listen, a huge thanks to Matt and Vanessa, Steve and Ed. Really enjoyed working with all of you. I hope our audience members found this valuable. And of course, we're all available for questions if anybody wants to reach out to us individually. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.